Welcome to episode 32 of Lucretius Today. I am your host, Cassius, and together with my panelists from the EpicureanFriends.com forum, we'll walk you through the 6 books of Lucretius's poem and discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. Be aware that none of us are professional philosophers, and everyone here is a self-taught Epicurean. We encourage you to study Epicurus for yourself, and we suggest the best place to start is the book Epicurus and His Philosophy by Canadian professor Norman DeWitt. Today we'll be discussing the implications of the Epicurean doctrine that the atoms are colorless. Let's join the discussion with Martin reading today's text.
Now come on, attend to the rules which I have found by a labor very delightful to myself, lest you should think those bodies that appear white to your eyes are composed of white seeds, or such as show black are formed of black, or what colour soever a thing wears, you should conclude the cause of it to be that the seeds of which it is made are stained with the same colour. For the principles of matter are void of all colour, both like or unlike what appears upon the bodies they produce. If you should chance to think that the mind cannot possibly form an idea of seeds without colour, you are under a strange mistake. For persons born blind, who never saw the light of the sun, yet discover bodies by the touch, as if they had no manner of colour belonging to them. So that seeds imbued with no colour can offer themselves to our mind and be conceived by us. And besides, the things we touch in the dark night we distinguish without any regard to the colour they may otherwise appear in. That seeds may be void of colour I have shown. I shall now prove that they actually are so. Now every colour may be changed one into another, but the principle of things will by no means admit of change. There necessarily must be something that remains immutable, lest all things should be utterly reduced to nothing, for whatsoever is changed and breaks the bounds of its first nature instantly dies and is no more what first it was. Be cautious therefore how you stain the seeds of things with colour, lest all things should recur to nothing and be utterly destroyed. Besides, though nature bestows no colour upon seeds, yet they are endued with different figures, from which they form and vary the colours of every kind which show upon them. For it is of great concern what seeds unite with others, and what positions they are preserved, and what motions they give and receive among themselves. And thus you may readily account why things that just before appeared black should suddenly look white, as the sea, when the rough winds enrage the waters, grows white with foaming waves. So you may say of what commonly appears black to us, when the seeds of which it is formed are mingled, and their order changed, when some new seeds are added, and some old ones are removed, the direct consequence is that its colour is changed and appears white. But if the water of the sea consisted essentially of blue particles, it could by no means change into white colour. Disturb the order of the seeds how you would, the principles that are blue would never pass into white. But if you say that the seeds which make the sea look of one uniform white are stained with different colours, as a perfect square that is one figure is made up of several bodies that are of several figures, then it would follow that, as we perfectly see that dissimilar figures which the square contains within it, so we might discover in the water of the sea or in any other body of one simple colour the mixed and different colours from which that simple colour proceeds. Besides, the dissimilar figures that go to make up a square do by no means hinder that the surface of the body should appear square, but a mixed variety of colours will forever prevent that the surface of any body should appear of one fixed and uniform colour. And then the very reason that would incline us sometimes to impute colours to seeds is by this means destroyed, or in this case white bodies are not produced from white or black from black, but from seeds of various colours. Now white would much sooner proceed from seeds of no colour at all than from such as are black or any other opposite colour whatsoever. Besides, since colours cannot appear without light, and since the seeds of things cannot appear in the light, you may then conclude that they are covered with no colours at all. For how can any colour show itself in the dark which surround in the light itself, as it is differently struck either with a direct or oblique ray of light? After this manner, the plumes of doves, which grow about their neck and are an ornament to it, show themselves in the sun. In one position they appear red, like a fiery carbuncle. In another light, the greenness of the emerald is mixed with the sky blue. So likewise, the tail of the peacock, all filled with light, changes its colours as the rays strike directly or obliquely upon it. Since therefore colours are produced only by the strokes of light, we cannot suppose that they can possibly exist without it.
Thank you, Martin. So we're back this week to discussing the characteristics of the atom, and today's focus is on color, but probably goes a lot deeper than just what we might superficially think is the issue here. Maybe one thing before I ask for comments, nobody's ever seen an atom before, and Epicurus is not saying that we can see atoms, and yet we're discussing whether they have a color or not. And so that is a question itself. What form of analysis are we using here? How are we approaching something in terms of saying that it has a visible characteristic when we're talking about something that's invisible by nature?
I want to hear what Martin says about this first.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm impressed is that he particularly pays attention to interference colors as what he comes up with the colors of these feathers, because they are produced in a different way as the regular color, say, of regularly painted objects. I mean, of course, he doesn't know the difference in this color, but he at least feels there's some difference there, and he makes then the conclusion that if the appearance of color can change, it cannot be a fundamental property of the elementary particles.
Right. That's fascinating to me that he noticed that. I mean, that does show you. So I think there's kind of a mix here, and once again, reaching conclusions beyond what observations can tell you, but in another, right here at the end where he talks about the light, your observations can be very informing. If you're really paying attention, you realize things. So that's pretty cool.
And of course, from today's models where we know how color arises and how it comes, it just appears weird how this is formulated here. But nevertheless, it's quite interesting that you really can draw somewhat partially valid conclusions from just thinking about the observations. And if we try to think about how we can define a color for an elementary particle, I mean, it would not. We would need to expand the electromagnetic spectrum considerably. For example, we could take the frequency of the radiation emitted upon annihilation with antimatter as the color of the elementary particle, and that would be then far in the gamma ray range. So it's not visible to our eyes, but we can detect it with the instruments. So we cannot assign it a red, green, blue value corresponding to what is in this rather narrow spectral range of what we perceive as visible, but we can assign it some sort of abstract color values, or right away then use the wavelength or the frequency of that radiation as the quantifier for the color.
Yeah, and we can't even say really that it would be impossible for a creature with different eyes, some other kind of capability. I mean, there are animals that can see colors that we can't see, and we wouldn't even know how to imagine them because they're just not in our sensory experience.
Or humans that are, I guess, what's called colorblind. People don't see colors the same way.
Right. That's true too. Have you ever done one of those color tests where you can it kind of tells you about the cone density in your eyes, whether you can distinguish between fine differences in shades?
I have not. I think the only thing I've heard in growing up was there's something about you can't be a pilot or an astronaut or something like that if you're colorblind. I can't remember what I'm really thinking about there. But Martin,
the inability to distinguish between, I think it's red and green.
I mean, there are different types of colors which can not be distinguished.
Right.
And by the way, there are certain jobs in my laboratory which I cannot assign to someone if someone was colorblind. So every time we interview a person, we make a test for colorblindness so that we know this. It's not a reason to not hire the person, but there are certain jobs we can then just not assign to that person because you need to have good color vision to do the analysis.
And so it's not just what I was thinking about is not actually strictly color blindness, but color discrimination between shades of the same color varies, and your sensitivity to very subtle shades of color can vary. So I read somewhere that women are more sensitive to yellow, that we're more likely to be able to see it. And so in babies in the newborn nursery, if they have jaundice, it may be the women are able to see that a little bit better, but it probably wouldn't be, if it's that subtle, clinically it's not going to be anything real important. But I've taken this test before to see whether I can distinguish between more of the colors, and I have whatever they tested as the maximum number of cone density in my retina. I can tell like super fine shades. So I might tell you your shirt and your pants don't match, but you might not be able to see that they're not the same color. You know what I'm saying? He doesn't talk in this section about our perception of the color. That's kind of off topic, but still a related subject, that if you notice what's going on, and that some people around you can match their clothes accurately and some people can't, that can tell you something about your physiology, about human physiology. And then there are animals that can see colors that we don't even have words for, because our retinas just don't do that.
That's probably an argument that could have easily been incorporated within this section.
Yeah,
I would think.
That's what made me think.
Flows right along with it. Yeah. Well, let's look at the second paragraph, because I'm thinking that this whole section today has some deeper philosophical aspects of it that we need to address beyond the physics side as usual. And the second paragraph of what we're reading from has the section that says, "Now every color may be changed one into another, but the principle of things will by no means admit of change. There necessarily must be something that remains immutable, lest all things should utterly be reduced to nothing. For whatsoever is changed and breaks the bounds of its first nature instantly dies and is no more what first it was. Be cautious, therefore, how you stain the seeds of things with color, lest all things should recur to nothing and be utterly destroyed." So he is linking the issue of the existence of color to the most fundamental existence of the universe. And I suspect Elaine in particular, but Martin as well, you guys may have some thoughts about that type of reasoning, because it's not really a physics-oriented as much, I think, as it is a much higher level logical argument that's again being employed against people who are fans of infinite divisibility.
I want to hear what Martin says first.
Yeah, again, so this is so weird in the viewpoint of what we now know about color. I mean, where we see color from is typically from what we call atoms or molecules, and they are in the scheme of matter in Epicurus, they are composed bodies. Huh? So that means we see some transition between excitation levels in these composed bodies. So and that one, I mean, except for this weird type of definition I gave before, there is no real meaningful color to be assigned to this, or in a really funny environment. So we can create complexes which are formally written like a bunch of compounds forming a complex allowed an electron, and then this complex appears blue. So that means we can tentatively assign blue as a color to the electron in this context, but if we change that setup, we may see an entirely different color, because what we see is that transition the electron makes between two excitation states, and they will be different elsewhere. So if we look in a dye, then there will be specific transitions which the electrons in there make, and then, I mean, that electron is not different from any other electron, but now the color appears different. So that means this is not the color of the elementary particle, but rather that of the composed body.
Martin, before we shift back over to Elaine, let me ask you to focus particularly on the part of that passage that reads as follows. And I think you can pretty much take this out of the rest of it, and he is going to hold to this principle regardless of whether he's talking about color or something else. And the part I want you to really focus on is, quote, "The principles of things will by no means admit of change. There necessarily must be something that remains immutable, lest all things should be utterly reduced to nothing." What do you think of that?
Yeah, I mean, again, this is so weird. So knowing now what I explained, how we actually color, see, we conceive of a set of elementary particles which would have color, and then this would not produce a problem. So I don't really follow Lucretius here on the necessity of those elementary particles not having a color. Yeah, and especially not when the dramatic, as he puts it here, so that for whatever is changed, it instantly dies. No? So I somehow don't follow that logic.
Martin, I think he's going much further than referring just to color. He's erecting the atomism system on the viewpoint that there is an ultimate particle of some kind that has unchanging characteristics, that is not created, does not die or disassemble itself, but is an ultimate eternal particle with never changing properties. Now, the issue
and
that
there's
in
no
terms
such
of color,
thing as that. So, this is an example of where going beyond the evidence that you can observe can lead you to conclusions that don't add up.
Are you certain in saying that, though? And why?
We don't have any evidence of anything like that. Martin, am I right? I mean, we have matter and energy, so it's not like you get down to something that never changes.
Yeah, I mean, this is what Alan pointed out.
Alan was talking about, yeah.
Yeah. So that there are no such elementary particles.
So this is, again, it might get boring to point this out, but I hope not. It is important to really stick to being cautious when you go beyond what you can actually make observations on and then making extrapolations, because some of your extrapolations might be correct, but there's a good chance that reason like that will lead you into the weeds. But it doesn't matter, because in the big scheme of things, because it's not necessary to have some kind of unchanging permanent particle to say that there's no supernatural. You just don't. You don't need it.
Before we go further on that, okay, so what is the basis on which you are making the statement that you are certain that no such particle exists?
Okay, so no, I'm going to be real cautious when I say this to avoid sounding like a skeptic, and just so for listeners to review. The skeptic gets one of their central thing is unknowability. They just get real hung up on that. That's the most fascinating thing about life to them, that we can never 100% know anything, and so that's it. I'm more, and pragmatism had not been formally proposed during Epicurus, but my personal philosophy incorporates pragmatism. I'm like, okay, I can never tell you that there's not one, but nobody's ever found one, and there doesn't seem to be a necessity for one for a permanent unchanging particle. And so there's no reason that I have to believe in one. Somebody may come up with one. Find something like that, maybe so, but we don't know of one at this point.
Okay.
And it's not necessary to the philosophy to have one.
Okay, those are two different pieces there. Nobody's ever found one. I don't think anybody would ever argue that anybody's ever found one. So we're all clear on that.
Yeah.
What about the second piece of that, though? Because clearly that is what Lucretius is saying here.
Yeah.
There necessarily must be something that remains immutable, lest all things should utterly be reduced to nothing.
Yeah,
is he not? Well, is he not talking about is he not talking about the logical argument? I think, Martin, you've said this in the past about the difference between points and lines and so forth in space and mathematics. Is he not talking about the imagination of lines that have no, width or extension or size? Relate that back for me, Martin, because you know what I'm talking about.
I mean, that is an idealization which we use to think geometry, but we don't claim that this exists in any way in the real world.
Well, we don't, but there were these philosophers who were saying that infinite divisibility is the situation. And so, and they were using that, they were making that contention on a logical position. They had never seen an atom or not seen an atom either, but they were asserting as a matter of certain philosophical principle that matter can be infinitely divided.
I think you're confusing infinite divisibility with changeability. Those are two different things.
Okay, but reducing, lest all things should utterly be reduced to nothing here is related, I think. I will agree with you that they're different, but I think they're related. And in this context, he's talking about, be cautious how you stain the seeds of things with color, lest all things should recur to nothing and be utterly destroyed. So there's probably a distinction, but it's probably also related. When these philosophers are saying that there is infinite divisibility, Epicurus is rejecting that. But neither of them have ever seen an atom. Neither side has ever had an electron microscope or any of the technology we have today. They were approaching this from a theoretical, logical point of view.
Right.
And so the issue of not having seen it ever before does not really get to that same level of addressing it on a logical level.
I mean, what we actually have is so that we have particles which can be produced from something and which can be destroyed into something else. But what we see is we have a classification. We observe only particles of defined types and not something else. There are some particles which have, in some aspects, a continuous range of properties, but the nature of the particle always fits that classification we have based on defined physical properties. And that is the only thing we need to really produce a world where we can see repetitive patterns, and that's something that only some phenomena occur and not everything. So this one, basically something like this, is now replacing the much easier model from Epicurus, which said that these elementary particles are eternal, indestructible, and cannot be made.
Yeah, I mean, that's good, because that's what I was thinking, Martin. Yeah, so Epicurus was right to reject making conclusions from reasoning and logic. It's you can make provisional ideas of, theories about things, hypotheses, but you'll be wrong a lot. So
before we move on, I just want to be clear about what you guys are thinking about somebody who contends that matter is infinitely divisible. Obviously, you're saying Epicurus.
They need to show me.
Okay, you would apply the same standard to them as you would to Epicurus, obviously, is what you're saying.
Obviously, all the time.
So what is your position then ultimately on whether things are infinitely divisible?
No, they are not, because we see that things are orderly and reproducible. If things are always continuous without something elementary at the end, we would not see orderly phenomena as we see now. We would not have a world like we have it now. So not something that, for example, one species, typically then the offspring is from the same species.
Yeah, well, now, Martin, in what you just said, you stated exactly the position that Lucretius is taking here, haven't you?
Yes, but he's talking about things that we observe. So that would be not just logically inconsistent with what we would observe. It would make what we observe impossible. So I don't know. This is a different kind of thing to do that than to go into proposing properties of the fundamental particles that we haven't observed, and that there could be more than one way things could work. So I don't know how to explain that better.
The important point that I'm hearing you say, though, to me, is that you're saying you would reject both contentions. The contention that matter is infinitely divisible and the contention that matter is not infinitely divisible. You're rejecting both of them, Elaine. Is that correct?
No.
Is that a good...
No. I'm rejecting that are fundamental particles that are permanent and unchanging. And the reason he got to that was he made too much of a leap. He went too far. He went beyond what his observations told him. But I think our observations support concluding that matter isn't infinitely divisible. I think that's something we have observed and concluded versus versus this other that the particles are unchangeable. So it's two different enough ideas. One where he went too far beyond what he could observe, and one where the observations support the conclusion.
Okay, so you're just very firmly and clearly separating the issue of immutability versus indivisibility.
Yes.
Martin, do you agree with that?
When I see this as, to give an example, how his concept feasibly works out. So he gives feasible models, which in the end now we know are mostly wrong, but still at that time it was demonstrating how his system works and accounts completely for all natural phenomena without resorting to anything supernatural. So that is the benefit of these models, which have no real empirical backing. It's just that he produces these conceivable models to explain the phenomena.
Yeah.
And so, Martin, to wrap up on the distinction between immutable versus indivisible, your viewpoint on that is what?
Yeah, the individual particle is not immutable, but the class of particles it belongs to, that one is stable. So that one we will always produce under similar conditions that same particle again, and it will again disappear into something else under comparable conditions.
Okay. With the conclusion on the indivisible part, though, that you do not see science disputing the issue that Lucretius is saying here, that there is an ultimate particle which is ultimately indivisible.
Yeah. So that one we pretty much our models indicate this. So we consider an electron as indivisible. For the protons and neutrons, it's a bit a debate now. These quarks do not really classify as particles, in my view. So we may still consider protons and neutrons as elementary particles, even though in the modeling we set them up as being put together by quarks. But again, these quarks do not really feel do not really have the feel of particles like what I would consider a particle. Then a photon would certainly could be classified as a elementary particle, and these can be for photons are easily annihilated and again produced.
Yeah. So
okay.
You see, Cassius, what Martin is talking about is observed behaviors, not extrapolating too far. He's saying those things based on how they behave.
Based on technology far in advance of any things that the Epicureans had 2,000 years ago.
Right. But still the process of making observations, that's not any different. So I'm not letting them off the hook for going too far and making conclusions from observations, because I don't want people today to think, I want people to notice when they're making observations and when they're, guessing at what might explain that or what the observations might imply, and not go too far. That is one of the things I really liked when I read Epicurus. Is I don't think he would have liked the day of reason, that he would have wanted a day of evidence. But then it's easy to, even for somebody like Epicurus, Lucretius, to accidentally, I guess, go too far. So any one of us probably could do that too.
Okay. A lot of the rest of this passage today is probably right on point with what we've discussed already. I would like to take a few minutes before we close today, though, to point out, and I'll put this link in the notes for today's show, that in chapter 15 of A Few Days in Athens, Francis Wright comes back to this issue of color. And you guys, if you're looking at the page, I've placed this down on the page after the opening text for today. But I want to read a paragraph from Francis Wright that is in a discussion, like I said, in chapter 15, about qualities of matter and how whether matter is inert or not, and what inert means and so forth. And in the middle of that discussion, Francis Wright puts these words in the mouth of one of the characters as if she thought this would probably be the Epicurean position. She said, "What is in a substance cannot be separate from it, and is not all matter a compound of qualities? hardness, extension, form, color, motion, rest. Take away all these, and where is matter? To conceive of mind independent of matter is as if we should conceive of color independent of a substance colored. What is form if not a body of a particular shape? What is thought if not something which thinks? Destroy the substance and you destroy its properties, and so equally destroy the properties and you destroy the substance. To suppose the possibility of retaining the one without the other is evident absurdity. And I think the important part of this that relates to our discussion today is where she says to conceive of mind independent of matter is as if we should conceive of color independent of a substance colored. Apparently, Aristotle, Theophrastus, others asserted that color exists in the abstract. Now, I think that relates to our discussion today. What do you guys think? Do you think it relates at all? And if so, how?
Martin has to go first because he won't say anything if I say anything.
Martin, does color, we've been talking all day about color as if we know exactly what color is. Does color exist independent of an object which is colored?
No. So the color comes or is always related to something. I mean, we can take just incoming color, then it's transported by that photon, but once the photon is gone, that color impression doesn't come back. And also the origin of this, the matter which emitted this one, also that color we perceive comes from that matter or that arrangement of matter in case of interference colors. So that one still fits.
Yeah.
Elaine, what do you think? Does color exist independent of a substance which is colored?
Oh, no, but I don't, let me just throw in here that we have the ability to recall colors after having seen them. And I don't know if that is what made the idealists, did that throw them off, to make them think that because you could imagine it, that it had to exist apart from what was colored. But your brain is, when you're doing that, is reproducing the processing that led you to experience the color. And to me, this also brings up the difference between something quantifiable like the wavelength of light with color and qualia, how it, what it feels like to see red versus the physics description of the color red. And obviously that's happening in the brain, and we know that, but it's an experience of it. I think that's probably relevant to what Frances Wright said.
I think you're right. I think where she's going is that certain philosophers allege that there are reference ideals somewhere in the universe, that there is a perfect yellow, that all yellow that we see here is a reflection of yellow, either in Plato's world of ideal forms and I think really the second one is really more related to what we're discussing. Apparently Aristotle decided that yellow does not exist in Plato's world of ideal forms, but that there is an essence of yellow within an object.
Yeah.
And that seems to be what Epicurus is objecting to.
I think they're mixing up qualia. They're somehow in their minds, they're getting confused about qualia, but I don't know. Kind of hard to say why they went there, but it doesn't make any sense to me. What would this be?
I'm reminded I'm dealing with a doctor and a physicist today, as opposed to somebody who gets really wrapped up in the logic of words and logical arguments like that. I think that you're right to take the attitude that you do. It's just frustrating that there are people who want to use words and these concepts of ideas to basically come up with things that are so totally counterintuitive of what you would sense and what you would conclude from just your experience. But I think that's one of the reasons this was important, as much as it may seem maybe mundane and not necessary to some of us as we read through some of it. Elaine, you see anything else in the rest of the text for today that we ought to comment on? Because I think we've probably hit the high spots.
No, and it's not a particularly poetic passage here that we've gone over today. So we've probably gotten everything out of it that we could get, I think.
Martin, any closing comments from you today?
Vielleicht just to highlight a bit on the last paragraph. So that means to make this as actually true statement. So the color is only visible with light. So if there's no light, there is no color.
Right.
And what we see in practice is that if we vary intensity, the color impression may change. No? So the color saturation we perceive, it depends on the intensity which we illuminate a colored object.
Martin, that caused me to remember that I put one more set of notes in the record for today. Do you see any analogy between the changing appearance of color, given the way that the light strikes it, to something we discussed back in book 1 about the difference between events? We've basically been discussing this all day today, I guess. The difference between events or accidents. In book 1, he was talking about how the Trojan War was an event or an accident of the particular place and time. Is it pretty obvious, or is it not, that the discussion of color is analogous to that?
No, color has properties of both. So color is in some way given by is a fundamental property of particular assemblies of matter. But on the other hand, it changes under circumstances somewhat. No? And if it's an interference color, it may change even radically, not only gradually in you. No? So that means color that does not really fall into an either-or category like that.
Okay, let me be even more specific. By looking back at the passage, I see that there's a list of qualities that he referenced in book 1. He said, on the contrary, bondage, liberty, riches, poverty, war, peace, or the like. Those are events. Is color analogous to liberty, riches, poverty, war, and peace?
No. Color is different. Like I said, it has some elements of both these accidents and actual properties.
Elaine, what do you think?
Say that again, Martin.
I mean, for example, if you take a yellow object, so if the yellow is just due to because it's yellow painted over, a regular yellow paint, then it will, with white illumination, always appear yellow. It's just by varying the intensity and the angle we can vary the hue. No? So for this paint, this is really a characteristic and not just an accident. No? And
right, yeah.
But if we, for example, take a structured surface which produces interference color, then the color appearance depends heavily on the angle of incidence or whatever the particular condition is. And then the color appearance is more accidental.
Okay. In both cases, though, it seems to me that it depends on both the material arrangement, the material properties of the surface, and so I have a hard time seeing those as really it's just a different kind of surface. It doesn't mean it's a more like a indeterminate, like the surface itself is what it is, and then when the light strikes it, you're going to see what you see. So I don't know. I don't understand how those are necessarily like totally different types of events.
What if we ask the question not in terms of war and peace or liberty and bondage, but hot or cold? Is the issue of hot or cold analogous to an issue of color?
Well, yes, in that the whether we're going to perceive something as hot or cold depends on what's going on in the thing that we're touching, right? But it also is relative to our own body temperature and our sensory nerves and what's going to produce the sensation of, ouch, this is hot or warm or cold. That is, all of our perceptions are subjective. They're through our own organism, but that doesn't mean that whatever we're touching, it has properties. So a painted surface with what we see as yellow paint, if in the dark, it still has the paint on it. The paint hasn't changed, but we're not going to see a color without the light. I don't know if that's an answer. that's what you're looking for.
Well, it's certainly, by discussing this, we are talking about the issue that needs to be thought about. So that is the answer I'm looking for from that point of view, is that it is an interesting question that whether, we go back to the general point that so much of everything we perceive is a matter not only of the thing we're perceiving, but also of our own organs of perception, our own ability to perceive it, and the things that, and the conditions under which we perceive it. The general reasons why we talk about so many things being contextual in the first place. But I think we do also conclude that there's a limit to the contextual aspect of things, and that certain things exist independent of our perception of it. So,
for temperature, what you mentioned, hot or cold, we can define an absolute scale and use a definition from there. And so temperature is certainly just accidental. It's not a fundamental property.
Same thing for color or not?
No. Color is different. Color falls between these categories.
I think today we're going to have discussed a lot of things without necessarily coming to any tremendously clear answers to some of them. But obviously, Lucretius and Epicurus thought these things were important to think about.
Yeah, important as examples to make a complete description of the phenomena. From that viewpoint, they're important, but otherwise not. So for someone who already has, based on his experience, says, okay, everything is natural based on the laws of nature, he doesn't need to know every law of nature or how everything behaves. Or he can focus just on those which are relevant for his life.
So you're emphasizing that you can make very scientific, objective statements about material things, but there's a difference between your ability to make those very precise statements about material things and your ability to make precise statements about things that are changing, such as war, peace, riches, liberty, the amount of wealth that you should have, and things like that. Those are a different level of things, whether you want to call them events or accidents or something else, but they're not by nature as directly tied to a property of an atom. And maybe that's not very well said, but maybe you can see where I'm going with it. I mean, there's a difference in the way you analyze these things. And so therefore, it's important for us to realize when we can apply the type of standard you're talking about that we apply to a scientific observation versus what we can do to analyze our choices in life. And even that's not particularly well said. But Elaine, can you make any sense out of what I just said? What is he saying about our approach to analysis when we think about how color is changing and that we should not believe that color is an intrinsic part of an atom?
Unless he brought in the subjective here explicitly, that to me, remembering always that there is, these things exist that we're seeing that have color, and we see them subjectively. That's what gives us the experience of seeing color. So the important parts to me in that are not really in here. I think this passage is interesting, but it doesn't lead me to any profound thoughts about my life decisions.
Okay. Right.
And I don't want to make more out of it than it has, in front of us. But for me, always bringing in remembering that we're perceiving these things with our bodies that's very important.
Okay. Well, we can probably leave it there for today and wrap it up. It's always fascinating to me to go through the details of what he's talking about and decide whether it has application to us, and if so, how, whether it's something we should discard as an obsolete way of looking at things, or whether we can find anything in it that tells us about the reasoning process, which is useful. And so by going through it in detail, I think we do learn a lot. So.
I think so too.
Okay, well, with that, we'll wait for next week and tackle another aspect, probably of the atoms, but we'll see you next week.
Yeah, I'm good. Martin?
Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Elaine.
Yes, thank you,
All right.
everybody.
I hope everybody has a good week.